30 years, the forces of autocracy
Russian army is committing barbaric actions.
Today we are 44 days into the war, and today's mini lecture will be on Russia. Once again, introduction, 3 questions and a conclusion. And by way of introduction, I should open up and say that obviously I come from a country which has 1,340 kilometers of border, so things Russian for us in Finland are very important. But I must also say that the things that I learned about Russian history, I actually learned them from Professor Bill Lavery at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. He gave us a set of 6 fantastic books on Russian history and culture and gave us wonderful insights. And I took the class in 1990 and probably has marked my thinking on Russian and things Russian ever since. By way of introduction, I always like to begin by this sort of classic statement coming from Winston Churchill that Russia is a riddle wrapped up in a mystery inside an enigma. And it's a good way, I think, of describing what Russia is, because the bottom line is that a lot of us don't understand Russia. And who would blame us? You know, it's the biggest country geographically in the world. I mean, Russia is, by definition, huge. Its population is not that great, 145 million, but remember, it spans across 11 time zones. You know, putting that in context, it almost feels like a quarter of the world. If you will. It has a lot of neighbors in different parts of the world, and you'd never think about it, but it's got China, North Korea, Mongolia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia as neighbors. On top of that, obviously, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and even a tiny little bit of Norway. So we're talking about a huge country geographically and a country with a long and interesting history as well. And may I also add finally, it has the greatest natural resources in the world. And one of the themes today is to say that Russia has basically the curse of natural resources. My 3 questions today linked to the war. First one is on history. Second one is on mentality, and the third one is on leadership. And if I were to give you one recommendation about a lecture to watch, it is by retired intelligence army officer Martti J. Kari. He gives a wonderful oversight in 1 hour, subtitles and all, about things Russian, and he's probably much better equipped to talk about Russia than I am. So we'll provide you a link with that. So let's kick off, and I am using some of his material here. So let's kick off then with point number 1, history. One of the things that you have to understand with Russia, and this is brought forward by Martti J. Kari as well, is that there are different layers of history with Russia. As a matter of fact, 6 have been defined in the lecture that I mentioned earlier. Number 1 is the Slavic layer of Russian culture and history, and that is pretty much about language and ethnicity. Second layer is the Byzantic layer of history and culture, and that is about religion and also about the fact that Russians quite often are inherently conservative. The third layer is Asian, and here we come into the Mongols, right? So this one is about totalitarianism, about cruelty, and about corruption. And I've learned over the years that a lot of the words that are linked to, for instance, torture or misery in Russian have their roots in the Mongolian, in Mongolians. The fourth layer is a period of unrest which ended around the 1600s. And you have to understand that this is a strong part of the Russian psyche. Russians don't like instability and unrest. So the Romanovs came in as czars in 1611 to stabilize the situation, to sort of come over this period of unrest, when you had basically a collapse of Russian society. The fifth layer is pretty much the 1700s, and I call it the European layer. And Peter the Great, one of the best books I read on Russian history, is about Peter the Great and his escapades in Europe, camouflaged in different courts in Europe and trying to get insights and understanding. And of course, Catherine the Great belongs to the same category as well. And this was the time when, out of nowhere, the city of St. Petersburg, which is, by the way, about 385 kilometers from Helsinki only, and you can really get there quickly by train, a fast train, St. Petersburg was created, which I still think is one of the most beautiful, magnificent cities in the world. And then the sort of sixth layer of Russian history is this era of superpower. This is where we see and understand Russia, and that sort of begins in the 1900s with the Bolshevik Revolution and the creation of the Soviet Union, when Russia really becomes an imperialist, aggressive power driven by, of course, ideology, which at the time was communism. And it's also the time when spheres of interests become part of Russian identity. So these six layers, Slavic, Byzantic, Asian, Unrest, European, and superpower, much more eloquently described in Martti J. Kari's lecture. Now, point number 2 is then about Russian mentality. And this is, of course, a generalization, but I'm talking about what I have learned, as a kid in Finland and reading about our big neighbor. So in Russia, there is this narrative of isolation, of being attacked and of being alone. And this sort of feeling that, the Mongols attacked Russia. The Nazis attacked Russia, and now there's this feeling that NATO is attacking Russia. So this sort of notion that the Slavic peoples of Russia have always been surrounded and attacked by enemies in isolation, and that they stand alone. You see it in a lot of poetry and history books from a young age, and sometimes also in Russian literature, which obviously has a great tradition also internationally. Then there is this mentality in Russia that Russia needs to save Europe, right? I mean, it's part of Europe, but not part of Europe. I mean, the Ural Mountains make the division, but this notion that, Russia saved Europe from Napoleon, Russia saved Europe from Hitler, although they, of course, had the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, where they divided Europe into spheres of interest, but nevertheless at the end of the day. And so, for instance, Victory Day in Russia, the 9th of May, which for a lot of us in Western Europe is Europe Day, is seen as, this is when we liberated Europe from the Nazis. And you see a lot of this similar language even today. So now what is Russia saving Europe from? Well, they're saving it from liberal democracy and decadence. And this is sort of the mentality that exists there. Then you have to understand two things about Russia and Russians. And I mentioned it earlier. They are very conservative. There is this sort of strong understanding of what Russian history is all about, and a sort of conservative mentality. And the way in which I bring it up is you look at the way in which children are brought up in Russia. It's very different from the way in which children are brought up in Scandinavia. I'm not saying it's wrong or right, but it's much rougher. And in that sense, it's much more conservative as well. And a second point that I want to raise here is this, understanding that Russians hate disorder. And the period of disorder in Russia was from 1991 to 1999. And the way in which I frame it is that it was a time when Russians got capitalism, freedom, and McDonald's. Right? These three things. And McDonald's might have been a sort of a stabilizing effect, but capitalism was not. It was hyper-capitalism in Russia. and democracy was not, was a very unstable period. So that's when, Yeltsin left and was replaced with Putin, who then guaranteed his life afterwards, Yeltsin's life. We went in for an era of stability right after the financial crisis in 1997, moving on to 1999. You should also understand that Russia has always, apart from that short period in history, have had pretty much authoritarian leaders. And those leaders, and I'll come to that in a second, they get their rights either from God, those were the czars, or then they get it from the class struggle that was during the communist era. So there's a very strong notion of leadership. And we in the West, we don't understand this. We bemuse at Russian leaders on television telling their governors what should be done, giving them instructions. And for us it looks a bit, what is this stuff? But that's the way it is. And I remember already as a kid watching, Soviet television framed when, the party leader, for me it was Brezhnev, sitting and giving instructions on live television to his ministers on what to do. And it's a different way of leadership. Final point here on the mentality still is that there is this sort of path dependency that we see in the Russian governance system. So you have the supreme leader who gives instructions to his governors, who don't necessarily own what they do, but they are allowed to govern. And then there is the path dependency to oligarchs, or the people who are allowed to make the money from the system. So you have this sort of very close-knit elite, which is linked to the loyalty of the actual leader and the path dependency. And this brings me to my third point, which is about current leadership and about Putin. Now, I can't say that I know Putin intimately. I've met him a few times, also always as a part of a delegation. I was a minister and I was there with one of our two presidents at the time, or then a prime minister. But nevertheless, I've been in the room, so to speak. And you have to understand that even with Putin, coming back to leadership, Russian leaders are never wrong or accountable. And this is the mentality that someone like Putin has. And I find it a little bit strange that in the West we're very much engaged in this sort of psychoanalysis of who Putin is. And this is when I come back to my beginning of the quote on Churchill that Russia is a riddle wrapped up in a mystery inside an enigma. This was all about us not understanding what Russia is about, and especially the thinking of Russian leaders. They think differently than we do. It doesn't mean that they're irrational, it just means that they are different. So I always argue that, when I met Putin, he was very well prepared, he was very analytical, he was very shrewd, he was very cold, and also very rational from a Russian perspective. So if we take the irrationality out of this, what is Putin trying to do? He has talked publicly about historic Russia. And that basically means making Russia great again. And for him it means one language, Russian, one religion, Orthodox, and one leader, in this particular case, himself. It also means taking over Belarus. It means taking over Ukraine. It is, and this is what we have to understand, about his legacy. He wants to see himself next to Stalin, who still is a hero in the eyes of many Russians. He wants to see himself with the likes of Peter the Great or even Ivan the Terrible. He wants to leave a legacy, and this means that he's not going to back down. And that is his rationality. No matter if we think what he's doing is irrational, what he's doing is rational from his perspective. And so far he has the backing of his people. Part of it is going back to the historic mentality, but the other part is also the TV propaganda that we're getting out of it. And you have to understand that he has no limits. That's why he has pushed the conventional warfare as far as he has. That's why there's always a threat of chemical weapons. And yes, in the background, there is a threat of using nuclear warheads. I don't think it's going to happen because he might be pushing his legacy, but his legacy is not suicidal. Therefore, I come to my conclusion. Now, remember, when you look at Russia, it's a huge country and it has a complex history with the 6 different layers that I mentioned earlier. Secondly, remember that the mentality of Russia is one of a strong Slavic identity and also a strong sense of national pride about what it is to be Russian and born in Russia. And thirdly, remember that leadership in Russia is different from the leadership that we might be used to in the West. It is very authoritarian. It is very much top-down, and a Russian leader is rarely wrong. I leave you, however, with a note of optimism, because there will be a day when this war is over. There will be a day when Russia will have to pick up its pieces as well. And I put my hope in the next generation of Russians, the youngsters who are out there on the street demonstrating, the ones who've been exposed to a different type of a world. I also put my hope to the fact that the curse of natural resources doesn't exist forever. Because of course the natural resources that Russia is using at the moment, 50% of their state income comes from oil and gas exports. That is a stranded asset in the long run. And when you are faced with a stranded asset, you have to live with disruption and come up with something new. I come back to Professor Lavery at Furman University. He used to say that, don't worry about it. Russians are usually about 20 years behind, but they are approaching. Now, of course, with the war, I think they're about 40 years behind. They can sustain a lot of pain, a lot of discomfort, but there will be a day when this war is over, when hopefully the next generation of Russians will come back to the international community. And I say this as someone who has studied Russia closely and lived next to it for most of my life.
Over the last 30 years, the forces of autocracy
The Russian army is committing barbaric